All right. We're about midway through something that we do every summer here at RiverTree. It is a series called What's Up With That? And it is built entirely around questions that you as a congregation asked me back in April. And I pick about a quarter of them, and I do my best to give you a good answer to those questions. And this is the question that I got about 2 months ago via email, and this is what's going to occupy our attention today. And I suspect that even if you don't use these words particularly, I'll bet you that most people in the room have thought about this question in some way, shape, or form at least once in their lifetime. And the question is, so if we as Christian people are forgiven, then why are we judged by God after we die? And then the emailer adds, that kind of freaks me out. Sure. And I bet they don't mean the idea of being forgiven, right? I bet they're just fine with that. No, what they mean is the idea of somehow having a post-mortem exam by God freaks them out. Now, what you need to realize is that Christian people have always believed in this kind of thing. For instance, if you take that oldest, most universally agreed upon statement of the Christian faith called the Apostles' Creed from 150 AD, you will find this idea of a post-death judgment, quote unquote, by God in there. Namely, I believe that Jesus Christ will come to, there it is, judge the living and the dead someday. By the way, do you know that this is not a concept that is unique to Christianity? This is a concept that almost all major world religions believe in. Even, for instance, many of the major Eastern religions have something that would resemble this. Now, for them, karma and reincarnation are involved, but nonetheless, there is still a post-death examination or assessment by God. So, if Christians have always believed in this kind of thing, well, what exactly is entailed by it? And let's see if the person, at least for the person who asked me the question, they can be less freaked out after the message than they were before the message when they asked me the question itself. And I need to tell you, and this is often the case with many questions like this, certainly about questions like heaven and hell and all that kind of stuff. In my opinion, there is only one best or right way to make sure that you are engaging this kind of question correctly. You need to make it about yourself. We're not talking about somebody else who someday after they die is going to have to stand before God and be examined by Him. We're talking about you. We're talking about me. We're talking about the person to your right and to your left. We're talking about the people that you have loved in your life the most, who have maybe passed on already. You have to personalize it. I would tell you that my opinion would be that Christians oftentimes, when they talk about questions like this or things like heaven and hell, they tend to run off into very strange territory when they don't keep things grounded in the reality of this is going to happen to me. This is as real as it gets for me and those I love someday. So here's what we're going to do today to investigate this. We're going to look at one passage in the Bible This concept is actually all over the Bible. We're going to look at one, because it is one of the signature passages in the New Testament about this topic. And we're going to do this deductively. What that means is, I'm going to show you the passage, and we're going to start to dive into it. And you're going to discover along the way what Christians ought to or should believe about this post-mortem exam by God, and maybe what they shouldn't. And why, ultimately, for those of us who are Christians, we should view this positively, not anxiously. Okay? So let's begin to unravel what the Scripture teaches about this concept. Here's the passage we're going to look at today. This is St. Paul writing to a church in Greece, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, beginning in verse 6. He writes, "So we are always confident, even though we know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord," which means we are walking by faith and not by sight. Yes, we do indeed have confidence, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. But whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please Him. For all of us must appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each may receive recompense for what has been done while in the body, whether good or evil. Let's start unpacking what Paul says. Number one, for all of us must appear before the judgment seat of Christ. In its original language, first century Greek, the actual word there is the bema seat. In English, you'd spell it B-E-M-A. Bema seat. And while that's meaningless to you, it is a very concrete metaphor that Paul's pulling right out of his own culture 2,000 years ago. What exactly is a bema seat? Well, if you go to any major first century town or city that existed in the Roman Empire, one of the things you would find is a bema seat. Most of the time, this was a stone chair or seat, almost big enough to be a throne, it would look like. And it would be in the town square or plaza. And many times it would be elevated. Some of them that they have found have been elevated off the ground 6 feet or more. So it almost looks like a lifeguard's chair, just made out of stone. What would happen at the bema seat is that the appointed Roman governor for the territory would ascend to the bema seat, and he would act like a judge. Someone would bring a case that's legal in nature before him, and he would render his verdict, and he would pass sentence. And what the governor said goes, because he's got the Roman Empire behind him. And in that day and time, if you got the Roman Empire behind you, it's all over. He is speaking for the emperor himself when he passes judgment. Okay? So, when Paul says to these Corinthian believers in a major city in central Greece, we all will appear someday before the bema seat of Christ, they know exactly what he means, because they've got one of these in their very town. What Paul means is that someday, after we die, in his language from the passage, when we leave the body and we are at home with the Lord, someday we will all stand before Christ, who will be seated on the bema seat of the universe. And he will assess and question us, very much like someone back then would have done as a Roman dignitary or governor. Now, what exactly is Christ going to do at that moment, after death, when this occurs? Well, Paul tells you in this signature passage on the subject in the New Testament. He says that Christ will be on the Bema seat of the universe, and each of us will receive recompense for what we have done while in the body, whether good or evil. So, apparently, as Christ sits there, stands there, whatever, he will begin to investigate the good and the bad that we have done in the body. Now note here, this is a passage about Christian people. There are other passages in the New Testament that talk about how all of humanity will face a day like this, but Paul is primarily, actually, if you remember the passage, talking about himself. It's about Christian people who will go through an event like this. So, there will be a day when Christ acts like that Roman governor, and he will investigate our lives that we live here while in the body. And he's going to investigate two things. He's going to investigate the good and the bad that we have done, and he is going to investigate the consequences of that behavior, the recompense of it. That's what he wants to get at. Now, if the whole judge image freaks you out, let me change it. You could say what Paul is saying this way. We will be responsible before Christ someday for what we do in this life, good and bad. And we will be responsible for the results of that good and bad that have occurred. There will be a day like that. Now, as you wrestle with that and you think about that, let me give you two ways that you can imagine what that might be like. Okay? Number one, I think part of what Paul is describing is an idea that I'm personally borrowing from one of the great Christian thinkers of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis, and you might call it transformation shock. Let me explain. The Apostle Paul, same writer, says in Philippians chapter 3, verse 21, that we all as Christians look forward to a day when, quote, our humble or lowly bodies will be transformed into the likeness of Christ's glory. I'd like you to imagine for a minute what that's going to be like. I want you to imagine what it will be like when you die, the inconsistent, forgiven, broken, right and wrong person that you and I are. And when you die, you are going to go through the process of radically changing. And all of a sudden, all the weakness, all the sin, all the proclivity to wrong, it's going to vanish. And all will be left is an us that looks like Jesus and acts like Jesus and does what Jesus does if he were in our shoes. That's what Paul anticipates in Philippians 3:21. I want you to imagine what that's going to feel like. Allow me to suggest, echoing what C.S. Lewis said some 60 years ago now, it's going to be as traumatic as birth. Ever been in a birthing room? Women in the room ever been through birthing? Husbands in the room ever passed out in a birthing room? You understand what that's like, right? Most women who have been through the process would tell you it's the most painful thing that anyone could ever go through. And I've seen at least several husbands say, oh, that's not possibly true. I broke my leg playing football, at which point their wife slaps them in the head and says, you have no idea what you're talking about. Traumatic. It is traumatic for the mom. It is traumatic for the baby being born. There is nothing that a human being that goes through that is more jolting, more life-changing, more life-creating, more traumatic than birth. let me suggest to you that your arrival in heaven is going to be that traumatic and more so. So will mine. You and I have never lived that way before. You and I do not know what it's like to live a life that is 100% like Jesus. On your best day, what's the percentage? 10? 15? Okay, maybe you're better than me. 20? I want you to imagine what it will be like. It will be shocking, will it not? This is part of what Paul is talking about. There, after death, Christians believe that we will stand before Jesus, and all of a sudden we will see ourselves the way that we are. Imperfect and flawed, feeble and broken, doing our very best to follow Jesus. And it will be like Jesus reaches down and pulls us at light speed upward into an existence that we have never known before. We have only tasted. I want you to imagine what that will feel like. That's part of what's going to go on at this Bema seat. We will be transformed in a way that, frankly, it is almost impossible to dream. Here's a second thing that we know that is going to be involved at this Bema seat. And you need to, again, engage your sacred imagination to help you envision this. All right. It is something that you might call truth shock. Let me explain. And to do so, I want to go someplace else, also written by the Apostle Paul. This is something he says to the same people, but in his first letter that he wrote to them. And he's talking in the first part of 1 Corinthians 4 about how they are looking at him skeptically in his leadership in the church. And part of his response to that is to say, look, I don't care if you judge me. I don't even judge myself. I look forward to a day when we get down to verse 3, or the end of verse 3 and verse 4 and 5. He says, I look forward to a day when we will not pass judgment for the appropriate time, that is, before the Lord comes, because the Lord will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness, and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then at that day, each one of us will receive praise from God. Paul's talking about the same event, right, that he is in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And you might label what he talks about there truth shock. Here's what I mean. Part of what's going to go on is that finally, when you die, when I die, the truth, all of it, is going to be made known. There will be nothing hidden. So says Paul in 1 Corinthians 4. All the light and the dark that is hidden away in our hearts, all the good and bad purposes, all the half-heartedness, it is all going to come to light. We will finally tell the truth about ourselves in a way that is congruent with the way that God already sees us, with his penetrating eyes. He sees the truth, we will finally see the truth. And understand, on the one hand, that could seem spooky, especially if you are somebody whose life is characterized by illusion, self-deception. You are somebody who is two-faced, duplicitous. You live a life on the outside that is not congruent with or like the life on the inside. Then yeah, you know what? If you walk out of here today and get into a car wreck, this is going to be a really shocking event for you. Because those worst fears you have about yourself, that you are that kind of person, you're going to find out are true. And you will find it out in spades. Because God doesn't suffer delusion. However, I do believe that this is not only a negative thing. I think you can see this as an extremely positive thing. How many of us in the room, myself at the top of the list, would be willing to say that we as human beings are extraordinarily two-faced. That it feels like our very soul, our motives and our will and our choices and our priorities are split down the middle, and we have such a hard time being consistent. Our heart is light and dark, and we have a hard time living out what we want, and we have a hard time resisting what we don't. For those of you who are familiar with the Bible, let me recommend to you that you read the second half of Romans chapter 7, where the great apostle Paul himself admits that much about himself. That he wants to do good and he can't. And all he does is the stuff that he doesn't want to do. We are all people who are duplicitous. Let me suggest to you that this truth shock, this moment after death, when we will stand before Christ and finally all will be made known, it is freedom. Because finally we will see it and we will be changed from it. It is an extraordinary act of God's grace that we will all see the truth. We will be willing to admit it. And for the first time in our lives, we will be able to take steps forward from it and leave it behind forever. Let me go one more place to help you perhaps flesh out just a little bit more what the New Testament as a whole says about this post-mortem exam by God, specifically in this case about Christian people. This is the same guy writing, the Apostle Paul, in Romans chapter 14. And he says in these verses that I pulled from the chapter, you can see that he talks about the same idea. For we will all stand, there you go, before the judgment seat of God. And then he adds from the Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 45, verse 23, for it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow to me and every tongue will give praise to God. So then each of us will be accountable to God. That's a quote, by the way, that the New Testament uses several times from the Old Testament. Here what it means is that finally all of us will come to the point someday after we die where we acknowledge that God's way, his way of life, his wishes for us are exactly what we should have been doing all along. And we will bend the knee to it. But this is basically a reiteration of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, right? See that? So what exactly are we going to be assessed about after we die? 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10 says we're going to be assessed about the good and the bad and the consequences of it, right? That's very generic. This is very specific. Do you see it? What are you going to be judged about? He just tells you in the verses before. Why do you pass judgment on your brothers and your sisters, your fellow Christians? And why do you despise your brothers and sisters? Don't do it because, for we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. So ironically enough, one of the things that's going to happen before God the judge someday is you and I are going to get in all kinds of trouble for judging other people. This is one of those specific goods and bads that we're told, and there are others, that we are going to be assessed about. Someday, if you do what Romans 14 is talking about, you and Jesus are going to have a come to Jesus talk, as we say in church, about that subject. Now, again, let's keep it very, very practical. You and I know Christian people who probably will go to their grave despising, in the words of St. Paul, despising other Christians or looking down at other Christians who are different from them or, in their opinion, worse than them. That would be judging other Christians. What Paul says is that they are going to have a shock after they die because they're going to have a face-to-face with Jesus. And he's going to tell them, I don't think you understood this particular part of what I was driving at very, very well at all. I think you need to go to remedial classes in heaven for a little while to pick up what I was really driving at, which is Don't be judged, lest you be judged. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. See that? For people who struggle with this, and who, by the way, if we're really honest, doesn't on occasion struggle with looking down at other people, being confused or frustrated by Christians who are different from you, all that kind of stuff. Who doesn't? One of the things that's going to go on is that we will all have to go to a kind of boot camp in heaven. We all have to learn on the fly about what it means to actually do the stuff that we love and yet are able to obey so poorly. This is part of what this post-death judgment is all about. It is about radical transformation. It is about this change to finally being the people that we long to be. So let me summarize. If you take this one chief passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and you add in the verses that we went to also, here's a good summary in writing of what we've talked about so far. These are the things that the New Testament teaches about this post-death judgment, quote unquote, by God. And here are the pictures, if that's more helpful. You have Christ on the Bema seat. You have personal responsibility for what we do and say. You have this exam down to the truth of what's really going on in our heart and soul. You have truth shock. You have transformation shock. Okay. Even talking about it the way that I have for the last 20 minutes, there's probably at least one person in the room going, okay, this does not sound like a pleasant experience. I am not sure that I am looking forward to this. Well, let's keep investigating that passage from 2 Corinthians 5 and see if maybe we can look at this event the way that Paul does, and I think a lot of that anxiety, at least for many of us, is going to dissipate. I want you to look again at those verses. And I want you to notice something. In fact, it's the only something that's repeated. Paul says in these verses, we, as Christian people, I myself as a Christian person, we always have confidence. And then he says several verses later, yes, indeed, we have confidence. So this idea of this post-death Bema seat experience that we will have, it is supposed to be, if we look at it through Paul's eyes, a confidence-inspiring event. Okay, how? Well, in this passage itself, he actually gives you at least two reasons why. He has extraordinary confidence about this event to come. Number one, he says that the Christian life, in a phrase that he will repeat several times in several letters of his, the Christian life is wrapped up in realizing that we live or walk by faith and not by sight. So says the great apostle of the Christian faith. He is not afraid of this event to come, and in fact is confident about it, because he realizes we all live a life of faith, not a life of sight. What's he mean by that? He means in this passage, we as Christian people are people of the future more than we are people of the present. We spend, in fact, our church time and life, we spend our Christian lives as a whole trying to pull the future that will be back into the present. That's what we're about. That's why church tries to do what church does. We are people of the future. We are not people of the present. We are people who are more wrapped up in where we belong than where we are now. We are people who are more focused on what we are becoming, not what we are now. And we are people who realize that we are at home with Jesus in a way that we will never be at home here on earth. This is what it means to be people of faith, not by sight. So I want you to think about this event, the Bema Seat judgment before Jesus, from the vantage point of faith. And let me suggest to you that if you just think about it in terms of faith, all of a sudden that becomes a remarkably positive, optimistic, hopeful event. Here's why. You and I live by faith, not by sight. We are to have an accurate assessment of the kind of people that we are here on this earth. We of all people are willing to have an accurate assessment about how hard life can be on this earth because we are people of the future where we are going. We are not people of the present where we are. So we tell the truth. And the truth is, this is a broken world full of broken people, and we are broken people too. And we always will be until that day. And then you will be healed. You will be changed. You and I will begin the life that we long to live now and do so irregularly. But then we will do it consistently. If you look forward to what will happen after you die through the eyes of faith, let me suggest to you, it becomes freedom. Who you are now falls away. And when you will go through the traumatic birth, second birth, into your new life in heaven. And you will feel it. You will feel the shock of that. But it will be freedom. And finally, you will be the person that you long to be. For we are people of the future, not people of the present. If you look at it that way, I understand why Paul has extraordinary confidence in the day to come when we stand before Jesus. When Jesus tells me the truth about who I was, not just the good but the bad of it, when he tells me the truth about the ways that I missed opportunities and I hurt people, it is going to be freedom because finally it's over. And I will stop being that person for good. You see that? Here's the second thing that Paul says about why we can all or should be confident. Paul says that this day, looking forward to a final culminating meeting with Jesus after we die, this day of assessment, it should be a confidence-inspiring event because, quote, whether we are at home with Jesus in the future or away from Jesus in the body at the present, we're going to be doing the same thing anyway. And what's the same thing that he's going to be doing? We make it our aim to please him. Pay attention to that phrase. What does he not say? He does not say whether we are with Jesus in the future in heaven or we are away from Jesus in the body at the present. He does not say we please Christ entirely. No, he says something frankly far more humble than that, far more accurate about human experience and Christian experience. He says, I am confident about that day because it is my aim to please Christ in all that I do. It's what I want to do. It isn't necessarily what I do. See that? Paul says you have no reason to fear as a Christian person about that day to come that we will all experience. You have no reason to fear if, quote, your aim in this life is to please Christ, unquote. That's all you need to worry about. Now, that means, of course, that there are probably some Christian people for whom this morning may need to be a wake-up call or a gentle reminder. I'm not sure what you're spending your life doing. Let me suggest it should be doing this. It should be intent on growing. It should be intent on loving. It should be intent on learning what Jesus taught and trying in your own small, weak ways, just like me, to put those things into practice. It should be your aim. It should be the desire of your heart to please Christ. Doesn't matter how well you execute it. None of us do it well. We are all F students in the Christian game. But is it your aim to please Christ? Only you know the truth to that. I've been around the Christian block long enough to tell you that the church is plagued, I suspect it always has been, by people who will say one thing, and yet the truth of it, the way they live their lives, is completely different. In Revelation chapter 3, we are told that those people are lukewarm. They are not hot or cold. And you know what God does with people like that? He spits them out of his mouth. That's what God thinks about lukewarm people. It's not pleasant. But you also need to take extraordinary comfort, because that one phrase is a phrase to live your life by. It is not about being perfect. It is not pretending about being something that you're not. It is not putting on airs and acting like everything is okay or you got it all figured out. No, the only thing any of us should be trying to do is make our aim to please Jesus. Don't know what you're doing, only know one thing to do to please Jesus? Great, do that one thing. You got a part of your life where you know for years you have been struggling to please Jesus. Just go to work on that. Look, the truth is, if we all did a categorical, comprehensive inventory of our lives, we would find dozens of places where we are not pleasing Jesus and could be. Just pick one. Get started. What's the desire of your heart? I suspect, based on this passage, that when you and I see Jesus someday, he is going to ask us, was it your aim to please me? Let's both tell the truth about your life and find out. And that has the potential to be an extraordinarily positive event, not a negative one for us. There is a Christian writer from the 20th century who has had an extraordinary impact, especially in American Christianity. His name is Thomas Merton, and he was a very successful, secular kind of man in New York City who in the middle of his life converted to Christianity and lived the rest of his life as a monk on a monastery in Kentucky. And he wrote some of the still most influential writings on what it means to live like a Christian. And they reverberate still today. I want you to listen to something he wrote in a book of his about what it's really like to try to live a Christian life here in a broken world as a broken person. And see if the standard that he sets is not exactly what Paul talks about here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 in that phrase, my aim is to please Jesus. Thomas Merton writes, my Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end. Nor do I really even know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does, in fact, please you. And I hope to have that desire in all that I do. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire to please you. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, even if I know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust you always, though I may seem lost, and even in the shadow of death. I will not fear. There it is. I don't know that I please you all the time, Jesus. What I know is that my desire to please you pleases you, and I will not be afraid.